Hi, folks, and welcome to AP Language and Composition for the 2021 and 2022 school year. I'm so incredibly excited to have you as a part of this course. This is a course that, much like writing, feels like it is always going to be a best draft, but that continues to update every single year and is so impacted by the students that enroll in it. And so I'm really excited to have you as part of this process. Thank you so much for joining us this year. Before we talk about the summer work this year, I want to talk about the motivation for the summer work. And then I promise we'll dive into the document that's on the screen and that's been shared with you. But I did a lot of thinking this year about what I truly wanted you to come out of the summer with. And in previous years, there's been journaling work, there's been books, and there's been expectations with those books. And as I thought more about it, I found myself thinking about not necessarily wanting to assess people based on skills that we haven't even really gone over yet, sending you home with a particular book and expecting you to read it in a certain way. But truly what I wanted you to come out of the summer with in preparation for our work together is, I guess, two things. One, a mindset, and two, a collection of writing seeds. And I promise to explain what I mean by that in a moment. As far as that writer's mindset, I want you to start thinking as a researcher, as a writer, and I guess as a reader as well, and to have that curious mindset about the world and to want to dive into things, to want to build up what we call our contextual pool of knowledge, in which we know a little bit about a lot of different things because we are curious consumers. I want to start that work. So that's part one. Part two that I want to come out of this summer is going to be some writing seeds, meaning not full-on essays, not anything that is necessarily submitted and graded as a piece of writing, but is more assessed on the idea of bringing in some ideas and saying, I think I'd be interested in writing on this particular topic. And here's kind of what I think I'd be really excited about. And of course, on the other side of the coin, here are perhaps some things that I don't quite know what to do with. And I want to be part of that writing process together. So when we come together, rather than assessing you on, a book or two that I send home to ask you to read, I'd rather start having some conversations about who you are as a reader and a writer and a thinker, and to do some of that work so we can start working together on how we can write about these things that we need to be curious about, and how do we make choices about our writing that move us beyond some of the work that we've started to do in maybe our freshman and sophomore, and for some of you, your junior year classes. So once again, our work is truly going to revolve around reading as writers, writing as writers, and trying to curate that curious mindset. So to do that, you're not being sent home with a book, and so that's why we're not having a formal meeting. All that you're going to need for your summer work is, well, I guess curiosity, but as far as what you're physically going to need, you're going to need a notebook. And you can either have a physical notebook or you can use a digital notebook. You're also going to have that option in the fall to use either a physical notebook or a digital notebook, and you don't have to choose this summer. Or I guess maybe the better way to frame that is, if you go with a physical notebook this summer, and once we start working together, you say, you know what, I want to do more of a digital notebook, you can make that switch. Or you can stay the same. If you start off digital and you want to continue digital, great. If you want to make a switch because you started digital and you say, you know what, I like having a physical notebook, you can switch. But this summer, I'm going to ask you to grab a notebook, either physical or digital, and prepare to do a little bit of writing in them. I want your writing to begin after the 4th of July because I truly believe that we need to take a few weeks off just to decompress a little bit after the year that was. But after the 4th of July, I'm going to ask you to start doing a little bit of work in that notebook here. And there are kind of 3 pathways that I think you can take to do some interesting writing. And so that's what this document's about. It provides some pathways, and then it also provides a little bit of insight into how we're going to use those when we get back. I also have some samples for you to take a look at that we'll talk briefly about in this video, but more importantly, that you can look at in the future. So let's go ahead and we'll do kind of a quick zoom in here as we think a little bit about curating our writer's notebook. So starting after the 4th of July, I'm going to ask you to start crafting 2 entries each week in your notebook. And again, that can be either physical or digital. I leave that up to you. Each entry, if you're writing it by hand, is probably half a page to 2/3 of a page. If you're typing it, it's probably 1 handwritten page if you're writing it all out. And so we've got 9 weeks of summer journaling. That'll be 18 entries that you are showing up with on our first day of school. Of course, please don't leave those all until the last week and try and get those all done. If you pace yourself, 2 entries per week is no big deal. So what is it that you're writing about? I have 3 pathways here that I hope catch your attention. And ideally, you have not a perfect balance, but all 3 of these are represented in your notebook. So they're here on our left-hand side. Let's start with our interesting texts. One thing that we're going to talk a lot about this year is growing and building out and deepening our contextual pool, which simply means when we're asked about something, we know a little bit about it. Like we've read or watched or listened to something that gives us some context there. How do we do that? Well, we do that by watching the news, listening to podcasts, reading an article, watching a TED Talk, whatever it is, but consuming interesting things. And as you are reading and watching and listening to these interesting things, then I want you to go to your notebook. What did you notice and what did you wonder as you were reading or watching or listening to that? It's your job to capture not only what you read or watched or listened to, but why you think it matters and how it impacted your thinking. What was kind of the new idea that came out of that? And we'll talk about some examples here in just a little bit. But in short, it's hey, I read or watched or listened to something interesting. Here's what it was about, and here's what it left me thinking about. Now, many of you already do this type of work. You have podcasts that you love. You follow interesting people on social media. You get some interesting news things. But for others, that's going to be kind of a new process. So no matter where you're at on that continuum, I want to be of help in that. And so that's what this little arrow is about here. There will be bonus resources that get sent out. Every single week, I'm going to send you 3 or 4 things that I've read or watched or listened to recently that I thought would be really interesting and that you might be interested in as well. You're not required to use those by any stretch of the imagination. But my guess is that out of the 3 or 4 texts that I send out, there's probably going to be at least one that catches your eye and you go, yeah, I wouldn't mind reading or watching or listening to that. And so I'll send those out through Google Classroom, and I will also include some ideas about how you could write from them. Again, we'll talk about that more as that gets a little bit closer. But option 1 for what you're working on in that notebook, interesting texts. And again, text can be things that you read, you watch, you listen to, things that get you thinking about this world that we live in. That's entry number 1. Entry number 2 is a cool adventure. This one I always love, but please take this with a little bit of a grain of salt. Don't get this confused with, my friends and I went to the beach and it was cool. That's not this entry. The cool adventure is the fact that sometimes our most curious moments happen when we are out exploring. And some of those are going to be big. Maybe you're doing some big traveling this summer to a place you've never been. Maybe it's kind of a medium travel. Maybe you're headed to the DIA in downtown Detroit or something like that. Or maybe it's a new adventure around here. Like maybe like you get super into running this year. And so you head down a running path that like you didn't even really know before. Opportunities are everywhere. And perhaps it's not even a place you go. It's just a new thing that you take on. But whatever that adventure is, I'm curious what it is that you learned by doing it or going there. What was your takeaway from that? And so again, that's that difference between a cool adventure of my friends and I went to the beach and we hung out and it was awesome versus, hey, I did something I don't normally do and it caused me to pause and think a little bit. That's what I want you thinking about. And so even if it's something like I learned to play the guitar for the first time, or, hey, I used to be super into painting and then I got away from it, but like now I'm back into it. That's a cool adventure. Why did you get back into it? How did you take it on? And how has that kind of impacted you as a person? So I think that's an interesting entry point, which is different from the interesting texts. So that's option number 2. Option number 3 is we need to fix that. This is any time that you observe or encounter a problem. I want you to write about it. And sometimes those are smaller things. You look at downtown South Lyon and you go, I feel like we need something else here. The problem with downtown South Lyon is blank. What is it? Tell me what you think the problem is. And do you think there's a solution to it? Like what is it that needs to happen to create some change? Some of those may also be much larger than that and not specific to South Lyon. This is where maybe you even have a little bit of a blend between an interesting text and we need to fix that. Maybe you read or watch or listening to something, you go, wow, like that needs to be addressed. Like that is an issue and we need to talk about this and we need to work towards doing better. Whether that's a concrete solution or whether it's just a simply, we need to be better informed. Anytime that you come across something that's a problem, either from your own experiences or in an interesting text, that can slide into your, we need to fix that. So I want you to go ahead and identify what the problem is, who's impacted by it, why it's problematic, and again, how might it be solved, or maybe addressed would be the better word. Not everything has a perfect solution, but how might we do better? That's your third option here. So why is it that we're doing this? One, we talked about that curious mindset. And so then as we talk about kind of how this is going to be assessed, you're going to bring your notebook with you the very, very first week of school, and we are going to use it immediately, whether that's a physical notebook or a digital notebook. We are going to use it immediately in a couple different ways. One, you're going to do a lot of talking with people in this class about what it is that you were consuming that you found to be interesting and how perhaps you would move forward with it. How might you turn that into something a little bit larger? And you don't have to have all the perfect answers. That's not the point. The point is to say, I think this could be something cool if I can figure out a good way to do it. And then our job, both my job as a teacher, your peers' job, is to figure out what's the best pathway for you to craft that piece. So, one, you'll be chatting with a lot of different people, and two, you'll be chatting with me. We're going to sit down. We will have a one-on-one conversation either before school, after school, during class, whatever it may be. And that way I can get to know a little bit about you. I can know about your interests. I can know about what your experience in English has been like. And we can start talking about what are those entries that are going to be the ones we truly want to think about moving forward with. And then we'll figure out how to do that. And that's part of the work we're going to do when we all get back together. When we sit down for our conference, here's kind of what I'm looking for. Here's kind of a quick 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 rubric. I'm not going to necessarily run through all of these right now. I know that you can read these on your own as you start working on these and as summer gets a little bit closer. But in short, here's truly what we're chasing after. This 5, right? Our top score. And so this is going to be where you can show me diverse entries. We're going to sit down together and you say, Mr. Pruder, like, here's some of the interesting texts that I really thought were interesting. You won't show me all 18. I'll flip through them, but I'm going to probably ask you to highlight a few that you are the most excited about. And we're just going to have a dialogue focused on not just what you read or watched or listened to, but why you think it matters. You'll show me entries that are varied. And so you'll show me a few from throughout the summer. You'll demonstrate high level of engagement by having a variety of different texts, a variety of different entry points. You'll have some interesting texts. You'll have a couple interesting adventures. You'll have some problems that you want to take on. And it doesn't have to be a perfect balance, but you're going to have a little bit of everything to say, here are the things that I was working on. Here's what I'm excited about. That's going to be what it is that we are chasing after. All right. So that's your summer work. You're not getting a book to take home and read. You're getting a notebook, or you're finding a notebook to start building up that contextual pool and starting to work on some writing seeds. What are those things you want to eventually grow into something a little bit larger? All right. So if you need a little bit of guidance, that is what these sample summer entries are for. Now, it may be a little hard to see these in the video. We're not going to read through all of them, but these are, of course, available to you. And so I encourage you to take a look at a couple of them if you feel like you need just a little bit of guidance. So as we talked about, you're going to end up having some blend of these 3 types of entries. It does not have to be a perfect blend. Please do not force yourself to say, ooh, we have 18 entries, so I need 6 of each. That's not what this is. But I would make sure that you have a couple of each of those. I wouldn't ignore any of these by any stretch of the imagination. So let's take a look at just a couple really quickly, as we can just make sure we understand what we mean by interesting texts, a cool adventure, and we need to fix that. So let's take just a quick look here. All right, let's start with interesting texts. Just a couple really quick examples here from students last summer. Now, many students used a digital notebook because we weren't going to start together at the beginning of the year. Some wrote these by hand, but then I ended up typing them out just so they'd be a little bit easier for you to read here. Here are just a few examples of interesting things that people read or watched or listened to and how they wrote about them. All right, I thought this was a great one. This is a great example of watching a TED Talk, an interesting text, and saying, I hadn't really thought about that before. So it's not necessarily a problem that needs to be fixed. It was more of a, that's really interesting. It was all about the idea of moving forward with grief. We often talk about the importance of moving on, but this speaker talked about the importance of moving forward. So our writer watched the TED Talk and did a little bit of writing about that. So yes, our writer did go through and talk about like, hey, like, here's what was in the TED Talk. But you'll also notice here, this was way more focused, not necessarily on summarizing what it was about, but the writer's own thinking and saying, hey, like, this got my mind going a little bit as I was thinking about this idea of moving on versus moving forward. So yeah, like there's a little bit of summary here, and it could even be longer than that. But ultimately, this writer said, here's what it was about, but more importantly, here's what it got me thinking about. That is what we are looking for. All right, let's take a look at a couple others here. If it'll let me. Oh shoot, now it's not gonna let me get rid of those. Sorry about that. All right, let's take a look at this next one. All right, as we take a look here, and sorry for having to erase, another great example here. This was another TED Talk, and they certainly don't all need to be TED Talks. So, please don't feel like that's all you're limited to here. Many people wrote on articles, which we'll take a look at in just a moment. But here's another great one. Again, not a problem, but it was all about the power of quietness, and that idea of so often we're expected to always be participating, always doing this and this and that, and very rarely are we able to just like sit in quiet. This was about kind of the hidden power of being quiet or being silent, and not in a bad way, in a positive, healthy way. So again, they watched an interesting TED Talk, but then they did kind of a broader writing on, so here's what it got me thinking about. Let's take a look at a few others here. All right, great example of a particular article here. This, of course, was last summer, in which that idea of privilege was really at the forefront of people kind of thinking about it. And so I love that this writer even kind of linked their piece here that they read. And so they once again said, that was an interesting piece, but rather than summarizing the entire thing, here's what it got me thinking about. It wasn't a problem per se, although it certainly could have been. This writer could have turned this into I feel like privilege gets in the way of A, B, and C, but that's not what they took on here. Instead, they took on this idea of, this got me thinking in a different way. So that was the entry point here. So they read something interesting, and then they did a writing from there. One more example here. This writer read something really interesting. They were reading about QAnon, and they were kind of like, okay, what is that and how is that working? And so they didn't take it on as a problem per se. They just simply went into it as I want to learn a little bit more. And you'll notice this writer said, so I came across this opinion piece in the New York Times, and here's what it was focused on. We've got a little bit of summary here again, but then you'll notice that as the writer continues, he starts kind of broadening out and thinking a little bit about more of like his reaction to what it was that he read. So it wasn't just a summary. He read something interesting, and then he created a kind of a writing base that was focused on, here's what I was left thinking about. So those are great examples of interesting texts. They weren't problems per se that had to be solved. They were more things that caused someone to go, that's interesting. That's making me think about something that I normally haven't really thought about before. That's the goal of our interesting texts. And so you'll notice these typed out were about a page, but like obviously it matters about font size and all of those things. But I think these are great little entry points. They're not full-on essays, but they're also not just a quick little one paragraph like summary. There's also some extension about here's what I was left thinking about. Great examples of those interesting texts. And so you've got a New York Times opinion piece, you've got TED Talks, people have listened to interesting podcasts before, and of course, I'll send out interesting texts as well to help. All right. So how about cool adventures? Again, these are not going to be inspired necessarily by something you read, watched, or listened to. These are the things that you are doing. Let's take a look. I loved this one. This was all about the idea of getting into gardening, which I thought was really, really cool. And this person talked about how that was never their thing. But then over quarantine and having the summer, they just had a lot of time. And so they started getting into gardening and like helping their mom with some of those things. And next thing they knew, they were kind of falling in love with this idea of being outside and getting their hands dirty. Notice, so this not only tells me about what it was they got into, well, they got into gardening, but there's also some broader thoughts here on like, hey, like me doing this isn't normal. I can't explain it though. The feeling of being outside, sweating, getting your hands in dirt, trying to create the best conditions for something to take root. And then here's that broader thing. So much is out of our control right now, but gardening is something I can control. So yeah, they're talking about gardening, but they're talking about like why this has been cool and important. This is not I just hung out with my friends and it was cool. It's I did something that was different for me, and it's making me see things in a slightly different way. What a great example about it, writing about an experience that matters and shifted your thinking a little bit. It's a great, great example of that. And I love too, there's a little personality in here too, right? Like it ends with like, I'm already planning to plant tulip bulbs in the fall, which will nestle in over the winter, and come spring, hopefully bring a nice pop of color to one area of my yard. I'm just not sure I'm ready to admit that my mom was right. Right? Like mom had been trying to get this student outside for so long to help with gardening. No. And then finally does it. And like, yeah, I don't necessarily want to admit mom was right, but I kind of love this. It was a cool adventure after all. I liked this one too. This was a cool adventure, not just into reading, but into young adult stuff. This writer admits, I used to think about young adult literature as kind of like not rigorous. Like that's something for people who don't like reading, or it's for like middle school kids, like young adult, whatever. And then they picked up The Hate U Give. And then they kept reading. And next thing they knew, this writer had read multiple young adult books that they realized were really freaking good. And instead of thinking about them as something that should be cast aside, they say, actually, this was kind of a cool adventure for me. They didn't go anywhere per se, but they took on something new. And so this writer, and they even admit that they got away from their initial point a little bit here. They ended up talking more about The Hate U Give more than anything else. But it ends with that idea of whether it's The Hate U Give or The Fault in Your Stars or Children of Blood and Bone, these books are really good. And they said, like, I was more engaged with these books than any book that I've been assigned to read in high school. What a cool adventure that this writer took on. I loved this entry. I thought it was super interesting. And then when I sat down with this writer, they said, well, what do we do with this? Then we started talking. How can we turn this into maybe an actual argument about the value of young adult literature that no one else appreciates? What a great essay to create, all based on the fact that they picked up some books that they normally wouldn't have, but quarantine let them. How cool. I loved that. All right. Let's talk about this last one, because I know the video is getting a little bit long. We need to fix that. This is for any problem that you come across. Now, sometimes these are going to be problems that you come across in your real world. Other times these are going to be problems that you come across because you're looking at interesting text and you go, that's not just making me think about something in a different way. That's making me say, we have to fix that. So there's a little bit of blending here between actual experiences and interesting text. There's a little bit of blending here. That's not a bad thing. Let's take a look at some examples here. All right, here's a great example of reading a text, but instead of just saying it's an interesting text, saying this is a problem. Someone over the summer read an article titled Vulnerable Inmates Left in Prison as COVID Rages. It was the first time that people started to say, hey, we're obviously incredibly concerned about COVID in our everyday lives. What about the prison population? And at first glance, so many people were like, well, that is not our concern. But this writer read an article and went, holy cow, like we actually need to think about this. This is actually a very vulnerable population. And so what this was focused on was not just what was in the article, but this writer turned it into a little bit of a mini argument and saying, like, we can't continue on by doing this. Like, we need to do better. Like, there was a mini call to action here. This writer said, this is a problem. We need to be able to solve this. Like, we actually need to make changes. We have to be willing to think about this. We can't just ignore people just because they're behind bars, not with something like this. Not with a health crisis. So again, this is a great example of reading an interesting text, but instead of putting it in the interesting text category, saying, this is a problem I think we need to address. So great little entry here. I loved it. All right. Here's another one. And I think this one was inspired by a text too, although they didn't include it. This was all about the idea of kind of women empowerment within the workforce. But this female student said, I feel like there's only certain women that are being promoted, and maybe we need to look a little bit closer at that. That feels problematic. Again, this was based on a text that they consumed. I don't remember if it was an article or a TED Talk or a podcast, but she thought it was really interesting that within the women's empowerment movement, there was only a very specific type of woman who was continually being promoted. And so she said, we have to do better. We can't just say things are getting better. We need to demand that everybody is doing better, and that gender inequality can't be just for some people. I thought it was a really interesting one that the writer took on. Now that I'm talking about it, I think it was a podcast, but don't hold me to that. Great example of a problem that someone saw and said, we got to talk about this. We need to do better. All right. Here's another one. I thought this was really cool. A writer wrote about why perfect grades don't matter. And this could have easily just been an interesting text. And so I asked the student, I said, well, why'd you put it in the we need to fix that? And he ended up talking about that idea of us being a little too grade obsessed. Not that grades don't matter, but that maybe we make them matter too much. We put too much emphasis on them. It's not that grades are bad, but that maybe we overemphasize their importance. And he thought that that was problematic. So he put that in the we need to fix that. And so he didn't necessarily have a perfect solution here. But when we sat down to conference, what did we end up talking about? Well, what would you like to see change? There's your solution. And it's not like we're going to delete grades. That's probably not realistic. But how can we maybe think about grades better? How can we grade better? How can we make sure that what appears in the grade book isn't just you doing a bunch of stuff, but rather is truly more representative of the work that you did? So once again, this was actually a short video that they watched. They watched the video and it got them thinking, hey, grades might be kind of problematic. I thought it was a really cool entry. All right, so those are great examples of some of these entries. And you'll notice they're not super long, but they're also not super short either. There's enough to say, here's what I read or watched or listened to, and here are my thoughts on it. Or if we go back to a summer adventure, thinking about not only what the adventure was, but why it mattered to the particular individual. All right, so as we go back and we think about this summer work, your journal, your journal, your journal. That is your only summer work. Starting after the 4th, that will give you 9 weeks. That's 18 entries. And I want you to fill that up with interesting text, cool adventures, ideas of what needs to be fixed or addressed and that we need to grapple with. I, of course, am here to help you in that process. I'll send out interesting texts. You can use those as much or as little as you would like. And please don't hesitate to reach out as well, either via Remind or via email. Not going to necessarily be able to get back to you the very same day, but I'll certainly get back to you soon enough. And that way we can be working together. All right. Folks, thanks so much for taking the time to watch the video and taking time to click through it and go back. Remember, like that's the great thing about this video rather than a meeting is take a few weeks away. And then when you come back, if you sit down and you go, oh shoot, like what do we need to do for a cool adventure? You've got this video you can click through. And of course, you have these sample summer entries you can look back as guides. Don't feel beholden to them. Those are just a few of the many great examples that we had. But I'm really excited to see what it is that you come up with this summer. And as you come in, we will figure out how do we write well and how do we make some interesting choices in ways that perhaps you've never thought about it before. That's our job with the work we begin together in the fall. But for you to walk in with those writing seeds puts us ahead of the curve. Thanks so much for watching the video. Please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions, comments, and concerns, and enjoy your summer.